So in my early professional years, before private practice and priesthood, I was a special education teacher and a preschool psychologist. I spent a lot of time in classrooms where most mornings began with something called circle time. Gathered around their teacher, students could hear about the day ahead, share their news, ask questions, and usually make some kind of pledge to be kind and fair to others throughout their day. Of course, things are not always smooth in those circles. Fusses and conflicts naturally arise among students. But the message from a good teacher is always clear. Each person has a place within the circle and will not be excluded or separated. In today's gospel, we do not meet Jesus in the classroom, but it is circle time nonetheless. Little children are trying to gather around him, even as the disciples try to block them. Remember, children in the first century had no voice or value. Again, not just in the first century. Jesus is indignant, the gospel says, and sends a clear message to his own students. No one is excluded or separated from the circle of relationship with God, which goes to the heart of today's very challenging lessons about human relationships and about marriage in particular. The circle of Pharisees are also present, and they're around Jesus testing him on the permissible grounds for divorce established by Moses. Of course, being lawyers, they already know the answer. They were not seeking enlightenment, but entrapment. They hoped to ensnare Jesus publicly to misspeak on a very hot topic. And again, not just in the first century. When is divorce allowed? But Jesus refuses to be distracted by what is allowed. He speaks instead about what is intended. And to imagine and perceive what is divinely intended, we can look to the way of Jesus with those children. That even when others would devalue, dismiss, or look to exclude us, even when we are separated by the judgment of others or by our own choices, we cannot be separated from the sacred circle of relationship with God. That divine intention is eternal. God's promise is a lasting promise. But we are human, far from perfect in this life. Moses knew this, that a lasting promise is something we often cannot uphold, and thus he gave guidelines for human divorce. And we know it too, that we will, each of us, make vows and pledges in this lifetime, formal and informal. We make promises of devotion to friends and loved ones, of commitment to volunteer groups, of presence and support to our faith communities. We take oaths of office for public service, a pledge of ethics in law and medicine. And some of our promises are sacramental in the vows of baptism, confirmation, ordination, and marriage. But if we are really honest, we also know that even when we make our vows sincerely and hopefully, we will, each of us, somehow fail to live fully into them. And some of us will further realize, often with great anguish and deep sorrow, that we cannot or should not live into them any longer. When separation in marriage or intentional distance within a family circle is the only pathway to health and wholeness, which is one definition of the word salvation. Well, in this country, 42% of married couples reach that conclusion each year. But even if divorce is commonplace statistically, it is never, ever commonplace personally. Those who walk that tender and painful road whatever the reasons, deserve our compassion or, at the very least, our disciplined silence. For no one has such perfect insight about the intimate lives of others that they should dare cast a stone of judgment on the choices or faithfulness of others. We never know the whole story. How presumptuous to think that we do. One of my very wise clergy friends, an elderly Roman Catholic priest, puts it this way: "We never take lightly the vow until death do us part, but if the marriage dies before we do, what is faithful then?" For us, of course, there is only one model of perfect faithfulness found in only one relationship. For even when we cannot create the unity and wholeness divinely intended for us all, even when we are in conflict and seek to divorce one another, we can never, ever be separated from the love of God. Even as we focus on what is humanly allowed, we must remember to reflect on what is divinely intended. And what is divinely intended always is spiritual reconciliation, peace, and daring new life. Now, mind you, new life does not mean we get to pretend that we did not live before. We are not invited to avoid consequences or justice, to set aside all the prior promises and pledges we made, especially to children or others deeply impacted by our choices. We are called to walk this life with integrity and to strive for compassion and fairness, even if we now walk separately from those with whom we once walked together. The gospel calls us to remember that no matter what we have done or left undone in this life, no matter how well or poorly we have honored the pledges and promises we have made, that even when our human relationships reach the point of no return, our divine relationship does not end. We are always welcome to gather around our teacher and hear what the new day holds, to raise our questions, to remember our pledge of fairness to others, and to take our place without shame or fear within the circle of all God's beloved. Because in our marriage with God, there are no irreconcilable differences, and divorce from God is never, ever granted. Amen.